If you're considering buying Victoria 3, you've probably heard a lot of very different, very polarized opinions on the game. Especially when the game came out, I saw a lot of people saying that Victoria 3 was just plain awful, saying that Paradox had destroyed Victoria 2's great legacy. Yet since release, the game has maintained a very dedicated fan base, with multiple content creators basing their entire content base around the game. And now, especially with the recent 1.5 update to Victoria 3, a lot of people are beginning to ask, is the game good yet? Is it worth finally buying if you haven't to this point? So today I'm going to answer that question, and I'm going to explain why this game is as polarizing as it is. Oh, and just to illuminate my bias a little bit, I am one of those content creators who has an entire channel built around Victoria 3, though admittedly a small one. So obviously my bias is that I think the game is good. Nonetheless, I think I have an understanding of why a lot of people feel the way they do about the game. So let's get right into it. Part 1. What Victoria 3 is trying to achieve. I think this is the best place to start when answering this question, because Victoria 3 is very different from all the other Paradox Grand Strategy games. The reason being is that Victoria 3 is in no way a map painter. Other Paradox Grand Strategy games will have a large portion of their gameplay orientated towards expanding your borders and expanding your name on a map, whether that be through direct conquest or political intrigue. Whereas in Victoria 3, while warfare and general border growth obviously exists, it's more a means to an end rather than the goal itself. In Victoria 3, your goals are much more likely to be economic or political. For example, making your GDP as high as possible. I've often joked that Victoria 3 is a glorified line go up simulator, in that all you're doing half the time is trying to get a certain number on your screen to be as high as possible. And often this is through very micromanagey kind of gameplay, looking at many different numbers on many different screens and trying to come to the best decision possible of what to do next. A really good comparison I like is to the tile yield system in the Civilization series. A lot of people's enjoyment of those games, at least partly, comes from micromanaging those tiles and setting them up in a way where they have the highest yields they possibly can. That's very much the case for me. Victoria 3 is very much the same, albeit probably quite a bit more complex. Another aspect that people often enjoy in Victoria 3 is the roleplay aspect. I will get into this a bit later, but in Victoria 3 you can consider the game to be a bit of a political sandbox. You can create whatever kind of society you like, whether that be liberal, socialist, communist, fascist, or even more obscure stuff such as theocratic or technocratic. Already from this first section, I think a lot of people will have a pretty good sense of whether or not they would enjoy this kind of game. And I think when we're trying to answer the question, is Victoria 3 a good game, or is it worth buying, we have to actually identify what the game is trying to do in the first place. We'll get into Victoria 3's warfare system a bit later because, oh my, that one is a big topic of contention. But I think it's important to acknowledge that if the game is not trying to focus on warfare, the fact that its warfare system isn't as fleshed out as it is in other games, that's not actually an issue. Again, I'm not saying that's the only issue with the warfare system or the only issue that people identify with it. However, if someone, for example, calls Victoria 3 a bad game because it doesn't focus on its warfare system, well, that's kind of missing the point, isn't it? Because the game isn't even trying to do that. And if you want a game which does that, unfortunately, I kind of just think that Victoria 3 is not the game for you. But again, the issues with Victoria 3's warfare system are not just to do with the game's lack of emphasis on it. But we'll talk about that more in part 2, the problems with Victoria 3. I suppose I'm already talking about it, so let's get the military system discourse out of the way. In Victoria 3, Unlike other Paradox Grand Strategy games, you do not manually move little guys or ships around on a map to start and fight battles for you. Instead, the warfare system is based around abstract fronts on a nation's border. Battles will randomly take place across that front with generals and armies assigned to it. So, there is a lot less direct player intervention in a war. Now, as I've already said, I don't actually think that this is an issue. Victoria 3 is not trying to be a warfare game. Therefore, the fact that most player interaction is not with its warfare system, and rather with its political or economic systems, makes a lot of sense. So I don't have any issues with this combat system in theory. However, sometimes it simply doesn't work. Essentially, since release, Victoria 3 has had a lot of complaints levied against it regarding this front system. It'll often move in ways which don't really make sense or screw over the player for no particularly good reason. That said, Victoria 3 has recently just had update 1.5, where the front system was drastically changed. In my opinion, these issues have been greatly reduced. They do still occur, however, it is far better than it used to be. I think when talking about issues with this warfare system, it is important to acknowledge that criticisms generally fall into two camps. One camp I think is valid and the other I think is not. The valid camp is the warfare system simply not behaving in intended ways. That obviously is a bad thing. The game isn't working as intended and is putting players into really bullshit situations because it simply isn't good enough to simulate what is going on. However, I think the invalid criticism is people criticizing the warfare system fundamentally. For example, maybe people think that it shouldn't be abstract, that you should move guys around on a map like you do in Europa Universalis or Crusader Kings 3. And to be clear, I think it's fine to have that preference. If you enjoy micromanaging your military more than you enjoy micromanaging your economy, that's absolutely fine. My point being, maybe Victoria 3 is just not the game for you. In terms of other issues with the game, I think that a lot of its game systems are designed to be applicable in very general circumstances that will apply to every country. However, the issue is that's not possible. Politics and economics and warfare are very, very, very complicated. So, decently often you will get cases where you try and do something but can't or find it much harder than you should to do because the game has rules which work generally but don't work for your very specific circumstances. Or in other words, you can't do something that you would be able to do in real life because the game is not set up in a way where you can. Now, I do think that this issue is present in pretty much every Paradox game, and to be honest, every strategy game. When you're trying to model something as complex as geopolitics or economics, there's going to be limitations. That's simply the way it is. However, I think Victoria 3 is a little bit worse than its contemporaries in this way. A lot of its systems are much more complex than the other games I've mentioned, and therefore have a lot more places to go wrong. So you'll just get a lot of circumstances which, to be blunt, are quite annoying and take you out of the experience of playing the game. So to wrap up this section, yeah, Victoria 3 does have a fair amount of issues that are pretty unavoidable, and depending on your tolerance for such things, could very well ruin your experience of the game. They personally don't for me. I usually just reload if it really gets that bad, although it often doesn't. A lot of the times I reload just because I'm bad at the game, but that's a different story. So it's not as big a deal as maybe you think it is, but it definitely does come up. I'll summarize this more later, but I want to talk about what I love about Victoria 3. So let's get into part 3. What makes Victoria 3 special? When I thought about how to structure this video, one of the ways I thought to do it was to go over every individual system within the game. However, I realized that was a bad idea because the beauty of Victoria 3 is the way in which its systems seamlessly interact with one another to create the most interesting political sandbox that I have ever played. In this game, you can take a feudal country in the middle of nowhere and turn it into whatever you like. Now, you can do that in a game like Hearts of Iron 4, for example, but in Hearts of Iron 4, all it is a change of flag and a change of the guy that's running your country. You don't actually see the gradual change of society and economy and political system in any way, shape, or form. In Victoria 3, at least when the game is working properly, things go in a way which makes political and economic and historical sense. For example, you can't just be like, yes, I'm communist now. No, you have to, let's say you start as a feudal country, industrialize the country, get the poor people into a position where they actually have voting rights, the economic power to make demands. But to even do that, you have to make sure that your lower class is literate. People can't understand Marx if they can't read. But before we even do that, remember I said we were a feudal country, most of our people are probably slaves or serfs. They don't even have the choice to get literate yet. So we have to abolish serfdom and slavery. But that's not an easy thing to do. You can't just be like, yes, slave owners, just give up your slaves. No, there was an entire civil war fought about that in America. And indeed, you might have to fight a civil war in your own country to get rid of serfdom or slavery. Or you might have to slowly disempower the landowners so they don't have power within your political system. But you have to do that without them starting a civil war. I think already you can see how complex this gets. Oh, and by the way, I haven't even mentioned the technological system. As your technology improves, you will be able to change production methods within your factories, mines, and farms, which gives people different kinds of jobs. For example, if your country has just gotten access to mechanical tools, it will need enough people who are able to operate those mechanical tools or learn to operate those mechanical tools, i.e. be literate enough to do so. But this is a position which requires more educated people to fill that role. Therefore, more people in your country, as a result of their education, will get more money, and at least if you're in a capitalist economic system, get more influence over their country. And also, if a person is more educated, they're going to want and believe they should have a higher wage. Therefore, if they don't, they are going to be upset at the current political system and try to change it. Therefore, if you start educating your people, there's a pretty good chance that if you don't give them what they want, they're going to start a revolution. Now, to be very clear, everything I've just outlined is a very idealized version of what actually happens in the game. However, I think that's important to mention because that's what Victoria 3 is going for. And I think a decent amount of the time, it does achieve what it's going for. And when it does, that, as a politics and economics and history nerd myself, feels amazing. Sure, it's fun to be like, ah yes, Britain is communist now in Hearts of Iron 4. Now let's fight on alongside the Soviets. But what's more fun is when I spend an entire game trying to create my ideal communist utopia and then get there after 80 years of watching the country gradually change in a way which feels realistic, but most importantly, feels earned. So if anything about what I just said sounded good to you, and you're not too bothered by a lack of a super in-depth warfare system, I really would recommend giving Victoria 3 a go. When it works, it is amazing. And it's only going to get better from here because it already has gotten a lot better since release. Part 4, Conclusion. I think a great way of summing up Victoria 3 is that when it works, it's amazing. But sometimes it just simply doesn't work. And while this is true to some extent with every Paradox game in my opinion, I think it is especially the case with Victoria 3. You get in a lot of quite silly situations in the game. I also think that Victoria 3 is trying to do something very different to the other Paradox games. Therefore, if you like Paradox games, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll like Victoria 3. Victoria 3 is a game created for people who enjoy grand strategy games, who are also politics and economics nerds such as myself. It is a niche inside of a niche, and it quite simply isn't for everyone. So to answer the question, should you buy Victoria 3? Well, it depends on who you are and how much you're willing to put up with, to be blunt, stupid bullshit. Because I know for me, Victoria 3 has given me some of my, in fact, actually, I'm just going to say it, my favorite experiences within Grand Strategy. But it isn't quite a 10 out of 10 experience quite yet. It's getting there, and I think it will get there, but it isn't yet. So now I hope you have enough information to make your decision. Are you willing to fork over $60 for an amazing political and economic sandbox that only works most of the time? I don't mean that's your decision. But I think it's important you go into it with the correct expectations for what it is. Alright, well that was a very different video, wasn't it? It's the first slightly scripted video I've ever done. I at the very least had dot points to work from, so very different vibe to what I normally do, which is normally a very conversational, casual tone that I take. So I do hope you enjoyed. I do hope for returning viewers that this isn't too much different to what I normally do and you can enjoy the content. And for new viewers, hey, if you've decided you want to get into the game from here, I make content on the game once or twice a week. Usually just playthroughs of the game. You can probably get a pretty good idea of how the game actually plays by watching those videos, although to be very blunt, I am not very good. Please like and subscribe. I would very much appreciate it. I'm trying to get this channel going, and yeah. Thank you for watching again, and goodbye.